You are 12, standing in a hall that seems to hold 1,000 eyes, and the man who should have protected you, your father, the emperor above all emperors, has just given your body away with a single drunken word. At first, you don't understand. You only feel the room freeze. The musicians falter mid-note. The nobles hold their breath. Even the torches shudder as if in disbelief. Across the banquet floor, the old general who demanded you, a man older than your grandfather, is smiling. He knows your father cannot refuse. Not here, not with the entire empire watching. Your hands shake. Your mother hides her face. Every woman in the room knows what has just happened. Your life is no longer your own. And your father, the King of Kings, doesn't even look at you. He gazes past you, at his reputation, his pride, the image of a god king he cannot afford to tarnish. When he speaks, it is only one word, granted. The guests erupt in applause. The general bows. You swallow a scream that no one will ever hear, because in this palace, a daughter's suffering matters less than a king's ego. And this quiet public betrayal, is where her story begins its descent. Her name was Amstress, and what happened to her is one of the darkest examples of how absolute power destroys even those it pretends to love. If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe to Sinister Empires. Hit the like button. Once you reach the moment that unsettles you most, tell us where you're watching from. Let's begin. To understand how a single decision at a drunken banquet became the start of 14 years of psychological torment, you must first understand the world she was born into. A world where one man's word could shape the fates of millions. Xerxes wasn't just a king. He was a king of kings, ruler of an empire stretching from Libya to the Indus, from Thrace to Ethiopia. Nearly 50 million subjects lived under his command. And according to Herodotus, who spoke with Persians who served in Xerxes' court, his word was law. A breath from his lips could save a city or erase it. But the real danger wasn't beyond the palace walls. It was inside. The Persian court wasn't home. It was a fortress of silence, guarded by eunuchs who owed everything to the king. No rumor escaped. No dissent survived. And everyone within knew one terrifying truth. The closer you stood to absolute power, the easier it was to be crushed by it. Inside the palace, even the king's own blood lived under strict rules. Where they walked, who they could speak to, when they could eat. Privacy did not exist. Autonomy did not exist. For the women of the royal household, especially the king's daughters, life was both elevated and terrifying. They were adored in ceremony, hidden in reality. Royal daughters were treasures of the empire, with even less freedom than their servants. Most weren't even named in official inscriptions. They were political currency, bargaining chips, alliance tools, offerings wrapped in jewels. And if that sounds grim, what comes next is far worse. Amstress' tragedy wasn't only cruel, it was whispered about in fear throughout the court. In a world where the king's was absolute, a single misstep didn't ruin him. It ruined someone else. And for a young mistress, that misstep was about to happen publicly, irrevocably, in front of thousands. Unlike many royal daughters, Amstress held a peculiar position. She shared her name with Xerxes' principal wife, the elder Stress, famed for her fierce and sometimes merciless nature. Amstress, the younger, was the daughter of a secondary concubine of Bactrian blood. Even in a court where beauty was meticulously curated, hers was exceptional. She was raised in the palace's women's quarters, educated by eunuchs and elder concubines in dance, music, poetry, embroidery, and, according to some sources, something more unusual. Xerxes kept her close, even as other daughters were sent to distant provinces in political marriages. A father's affection in the Persian court may seem protective, but here it became the star of her downfall. Everything changed in a single banquet in 479 BC. And according to both Greek and Persian accounts, while details vary, the core story remains horrifyingly consistent. Herodotus preserves the most complete version, based on testimony from Persian courtiers who later fled to Greece. In this telling, Xerxes had been drinking for days, surrounded by flatterers feeding his sense of divinity and power. In a moment of drunken bravado, he stood before thousands of guests and swore an oath by the Persian gods. He would grant any request made to him. That promise was catastrophic, and someone in the hall knew it. Artabanes, an aging general who had once served Xerxes' father, Darius, had already lost 3 wives. Over 60 ambitious and increasingly sidelined, he understood the political value of tying himself to the royal lineage. And he understood something else. Xerxes could not break a public oath, not after the humiliation of his military failures in Greece. To refuse a request now would signal weakness to the entire empire. So Artabanes rose. He bowed and asked what no one imagined he would dare. He requested the king's daughter. He asked for Amstress, the young mistress. A silence fell so thick it seemed to swallow the hall. Guests stared between the general and the king, aware of the audacity of the demand. Royal princesses almost never married ordinary subjects, and when they did, it was to young princes, not elderly generals. Everyone waited for Xerxes to refuse. Everyone expected outrage. They were wrong. Xerxes had sworn a public oath he could not break. Herodotus describes the king turning pale, gripping the arms of his throne, glancing around like a trapped animal. Minutes passed. Long, suffocating minutes. Finally, he forced out a single word, granted, and with that, Amstress' fate was sealed. Fragments suggest she attempted to plead with her father privately afterward, begging him to undo the promise, to find a loophole to save her from the life she already feared. But Xerxes, torn between genuine affection and the need to preserve the image of a flawless ruler, chose the image. Politics outweighed all else. Artabanes, humiliated publicly, could become a dangerous enemy. Binding him through marriage stabilized the court. That was a justification Xerxes repeated to himself, whispered by countless autocrats across history. The good of the state outweighs the life of a daughter. 3 months later, the marriage was carried out with all the spectacle expected for a Persian princess. But those who witnessed it remembered something else entirely. Beneath silk and jewels worth more than entire cities, Amstress moved like a performer trained to conceal despair. Her beauty made the tragedy sharper, more visible. She walked through the ritual silently, her expression frozen somewhere between duty and dread. Artabanes, meanwhile, radiated triumph. He had secured not only a young and beautiful wife, but a permanent, intimate tie to the Achaemenid bloodline. Yet the ceremonies marked only the beginning. The true consequences of Xerxes' decision were far darker than anyone in that hall could imagine. The age difference between them was staggering. Amstress was barely 12, while Artabanes was well past 60. Even in a society where marriages between older men and young girls occurred, this pairing unsettled the palace. Whispers circulated. Xerxes' cruelty in sacrificing his daughter to protect his pride. Those whispers would only grow louder as the grim truth of her marriage became clear. The first months revealed it painfully. Amstress had not entered marriage. She had entered a sentence. Artabanes, consumed by the desire to control and display his royal bride, kept her in near total isolation. Sources recount that he forbade her from visiting her family quarters or speaking with her sisters and mother. In Persian culture, where female kinship provided vital emotional support and identity, this severing of ties was especially cruel. Amstress was effectively imprisoned in Artabanes' quarters, guarded by servants fiercely loyal to him. She had no freedom of movement, no privacy, and no autonomy of any kind. Fragmented correspondence suggests she tried sending secret messages to her father, begging for intervention. But Xerxes, ashamed of his own decision yet unable to admit weakness, never answered. That silence would haunt her. The most disturbing element of Artabanes' treatment involved his conjugal expectations. Ancient sources, cautious in their language, make it clear. Despite his advanced age, he subjected Amstress to frequent and forced marital demands. His obsession centered on producing an heir with royal blood, an heir who would secure his position in the imperial hierarchy. Core physicians were summoned. Administrative tablets record payments to fertility specialists, herbs, and concoctions meant to enhance conception. None of this was for Amstra's benefit. She was not regarded as a wife. She was a vessel, a body to be used for political inheritance. 3 years into the marriage, in 476 BC, Amstress finally became pregnant. Artabanes rejoiced, offering grand sacrifices to the Persian gods. For him, the child represented triumph. For Amstress, the pregnancy meant something far darker. She knew that if she delivered the heir he desired, she would be bound to him permanently. Mothers of royal children could not be dismissed, divorced, or released. Her fate would be sealed forever. Servants later described her pregnancy as overshadowed by profound sorrow. She spent hours staring toward the palace gardens, where she had once danced freely, tears sliding silently down her face. She often refused food, forcing attendants to intervene. The girl who had once moved with grace now moved only with dread. In her 9th month, labor began. The ordeal stretched across 2 harrowing days. Court midwives documented severe complications. When the child finally arrived, a boy, Artabanes immediately named him Xerxes in honor of the imperial grandfather. The infant was weak. Palace physicians doubted he would survive. Yet Artabanes ignored every warning and began planning grand ceremonies for the newborn's presentation. Those ceremonies would never take place. 10 days later, the baby died. Official records attributed his death to respiratory failure. But darker whispers circulated within the palace. Some claimed that Amstress, driven to utter despair, had ended the child's life herself as the only escape left. Others said loyal servants, horrified by her suffering, had deliberately neglected the infant. No evidence confirms any version. Yet the existence of such rumors reveals how unbearable her life had become, and the consequences of those whispers were immediate. Artabanes, convinced that Amstress or her attendants were responsible, became increasingly abusive and controlling. Servants reported hearing her screams echoing from behind closed doors. They saw her with bruises on arms and face. On one occasion, he beat her so severely that she remained bedridden for weeks. When her body healed, something inside her did not. Witnesses described a profound psychological collapse. The young woman who had once pleaded, resisted, and sought even small acts of freedom now moved through life like a shadow. She ate only when forced. She rarely spoke. She spent hours unmoving, staring at nothing, her spirit hollowed out. Eventually, Xerxes became aware of her condition. Only then did he seem to recognize the magnitude of what he had done to his daughter. Some sources suggest he attempted a discreet intervention, ordering Artabanes to treat Amstress more gently. But within the palace, the king's authority meant little. Artabanes, now tied to the royal family through marriage and aware that Xerxes had sacrificed his daughter to preserve his own image, understood that he could act without consequence. Xerxes himself had created the suffering he could no longer stop. Artabanes responded to the king's private warnings with veiled reminders. The marriage and the treatment of a wife fell entirely under his authority. Challenging that would mean defying the very customs that upheld imperial rule. And so Amstress remained with Artabanes, her torment continuing without interference. But history has a way of turning on the decisions we try hardest to ignore. 14 years after Amstress' marriage, everything changed. Xerxes was assassinated in a palace coup led by Artabanes and several conspirators. The motivations were complex. Succession politics, rival factions, long-standing grievances. Some accounts suggest that Artabanes twisted Amstress' suffering into a justification for murder, claiming that Xerxes had become a weak tyrant, a man so lacking in judgment that he sacrificed his own daughter to maintain his image. The coup succeeded for a brief moment. Artabanes seized control of the palace, ruling behind the scenes for 7 months. Eventually, Xerxes' son Artaxerxes rallied loyal forces, crushed a rebellion, and confronted the general in the palace. Artabanes was executed in a violent clash with the royal guard, and his reign of influence with the same brutality he'd inflicted on Amstress. One might imagine that Artabanes' death brought Amstress freedom, perhaps even joy. The truth was far more tragic. By then, she was 28 years old, yet witnesses described a woman who seemed decades older. Her body had endured years of abuse and forced pregnancy. Her mind had been hollowed by terror and despair. The empire she was born into had never known her as a person, only as a tool, and even in the rarest moment of agency, that tool was twisted and broken. Her hair had streaks of premature gray, her face hollow, her expression vacant. Artaxerxes, her half-brother and now the great king, tried to restore her place in court. He offered private quarters, attendance, and the autonomy she had been denied for so long. But Amstress rarely left her rooms. She refused banquets, ceremonies, and festivals. Servants noted that she could spend entire days in silence, sometimes weeks, without uttering a single word. One day, musicians were sent to lift her spirits. They played a melody she had once danced on that distant night in 479 BC, before everything had been taken from her. As soon as she heard it, something inside her snapped. Amstress screamed, a raw, rupturing roar, and shattered their instruments before collapsing into tears. It was the first time she had cried in years, and she would never recover. Amstress died at the age of 36. Contemporary sources speak vaguely of prolonged illness. Modern interpretation suggests something far more devastating. Slow self-starvation, a form of suicide that allowed her the only control left. Others point to severe depression, leading to physical decline. Whatever the medical cause, those who lived alongside her understood the deeper truth. Amstress did not truly die in 457 BC. Her body lingered for decades, but her spirit had been erased the night her father said. Granted, her story was unsurprisingly buried. Achaemenid royal inscriptions never mention her. Xerxes is remembered as the builder of Persepolis, the ruler who challenged Greece, not the man who sacrificed his daughter to preserve his pride. Only in Greek accounts, Herodotus and later chroniclers who gathered Persian oral traditions, do fragments of her tragedy survive. Even there, she appears not as a fully realized human being, but as a footnote illustrating the excesses of the Persian court. Yet, by examining the surviving fragments, administrative tablets, and faint echoes in ancient texts, we can reconstruct the outline of a life shaped by suffering. Suffering born from a single impulsive decision made by a father drunk on power and surrounded by sycophants. Amstress' story forces us to confront a universal truth. The most devastating acts of violence are not always carried out by enemies or armies, but by those closest to us, parents, rulers, guardians, those who wield unchecked authority without conscience. Xerxes did not strike her. He did not imprison her. He did not order her death. But through one careless promise spoken to impress his court, he destroyed her just as surely as any torturer could. This is a cruelty of absolute power, violence that leaves no visible wounds, yet breaks a life completely. The tragedy of Amstress is the tragedy of all who live under unrestrained authority, where the will of a single individual becomes the fate of everyone beneath them. Her story, preserved only in scattered fragments across 2,500 years, reminds us that the greatest horrors often unfold not in war or rebellion, but in the quiet decisions made behind palace walls, decisions powerful men never revisit, but whose consequences their children and innocent bystanders never escape. If this story moved you and you want to explore more documented accounts of the darkest corners of empires and monarchies, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about which civilization or historical figure we should uncover next. If you've reached the end of this account, write Mistress in the comments, so we know you walk with us through this entire chilling descent.